Lost generation. Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws. To begin this video, and by the way, these videos are going to be the most important videos I probably ever do, because it's going to lay out the true foundation for how the world really works. And this is going to come as quite the shock to many people that are unaware of how the world really works. So I'm just briefly going to tell you how the world really works before we jump into this. And this video series is going to be the 20th century from the view of the globalists, or the 20th century in terms of the global chessboard strategy. But how the world really works is citizens are largely reduced into being subjects. Governments are largely reduced into being mid-level management systems. And the true deciding factor in almost everything is the central banking system, the supply of money, and the industrialists that are embedded into that. And you won't find a lot of these people on the Forbes richest list, I'll tell you that, but they own the central banks. And you really need to understand what a central bank is. It's a privately owned bank owned by private unnamed shareholders that you're probably never going to know, that reap profits off of money supplies to nations worldwide. And they also control the Bank of International Settlements and other international monetary funds. So the world is ran by financiers. It's not ran by presidents. That's number one. Number two, almost everything that happens is not a grand accident. It is part of an overarching plan, which it doesn't always go their way, but they are following a plan. And what I'm going to do is do the broad strokes of this plan. Probably this first video will be the broad strokes up until the end of World War II, because it takes a totally different form after World War II. So let's jump right in. To start the story of the 20th century, first of all, I want to start a little bit before 1900. We're going to start in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. Now, the reason I'm choosing to start here is because this was largely a war that had little support, but we were dragged into by a small cadre of commercial interests. So, the Spanish-American War, there was little public or business support for the war. There was a lot of press articles at the time which came out publicizing stories of horrific atrocities committed by the Spanish. U.S. got involved with Cuban rebel groups, which were fighting against the Spanish colonialists. And then all of a sudden, USS Maine explodes in the harbor there. Now, I want you to think about that series of events. Where have we seen this before? There's little public support for a war. The press stirs up images of atrocities, which we don't really know how true those stories are, but regardless of that, they affect the public mind, the public view towards that nation, towards that group, and towards the war. And then we see U.S. involvement with rebel groups, and then we see this miraculous event, this catalyzing event, which makes the war suddenly become possible even though there's little public support for it. That is, I want you to remember what I just told you. That is the blueprint for dragging a nation into war that is still used today. Think about all the gas attacks in Syria and the involvement with rebel groups in Syria. Little public support for the war in Syria, but they kept repeatedly trying to drag us in and using these events to get us involved. That is the blueprint. That is how the financiers drag publics and nations into wars. Okay, so the war commences in the Spanish-American War, and what we wind up with after defeating the Spanish is influence in Cuba, control of Guam, and control of the Philippines. There was actually a war fought in the Philippines, but let's just say for the sake of argument that we, in the end, wound up with the control of the Philippines. Now, the Guam and Philippines situation is a direct setup that will eventually, in World War II, bring us into direct confrontation with Japan. Cuba was dominated by agricultural interest. A handful of companies in the U.S. profited immensely off of Cuba, immensely. And the economic extortion that was inflicted on Cuba as a result of that is ultimately what led to the whole situation in Cuba with the communist revolution and Fidel Castro and all of that. That's just a side note. So we see a small cadre of industrialists benefit from that war, and it brings the U.S. into closer contention in the Pacific with Japan. Those are points you'll need to remember. Now let's move up to 1913. 1913, of course, the abomination of the Federal Reserve banking system was drawn up, and this was rammed through in a special session. Most of the Congress wasn't even there to debate on it, and then it was signed onto by a president that later regretted it. And he even acknowledged that he basically sold the U.S. into slavery, so to speak. So the Federal Reserve was pitched as a way to smooth out financial markets and safeguard them from collapses and crashes. There had been a lot of panics and crashes in the 1800s, and there was also a complex money system in the 1800s. So this claimed that it was going to come in and fix all these issues. But what we'll later find out is that wasn't true. And then in 1914, the very year after the Federal Reserve was created, we have World War I. Now, world wars were used as massive multi-benefit catalysts. So they get these world wars going, and they can dramatically and quickly reshape the globe with the outcome of a world war. It's very important to understand the financiers have massive interest in creating world wars at certain times. It has to be the right moment, but they fund both sides of these wars. And I'm going to do a whole episode on World War II because the whole war was a rich man's trick. It's not to discredit the brave people that fought that war and all the atrocities that happened, but World War II was a rich man's trick, and I will do a whole video on that. It's just mind-blowing. But they fund both sides of these wars. This goes all the way back past Napoleon. They're funding both sides of the wars. But I don't want to get off on a tangent, so let's continue. World War I, what do we see from World War I? The death of all, well, not all, but most of the old world empires. It effectively killed the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. A lot of these old world empires were killed off in World War I. It also established America's role as a power to be contended with, which is going to come into play in just a few years. The Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was structured in such a way that it explicitly set up World War II. I mean, if you want to draw up a treaty that's going to cause heartbreak, tragedy, and warfare in the near future, the Treaty of Versailles is the go-to document. I mean, massive reparations levied on Germany that they couldn't pay. And at the same time, they seized one of their most industrial areas of the country and ceded it to France. So they didn't really even have the ability to produce their way into paying the reparations. So that's going to create the whole Weimar thing, which we will talk about. So let's move on here. The virtual death of most gold specie in Europe. If you look at gold coinage in Europe, a lot of it, the last mint date's 1917. And some of it does reappear years later, but it's a massive nail in the coffin for gold currency and specie in Europe. And that's going to be important in a few years here when we get to the U.S. Another thing, it caused dramatic economic instability in the Reichsbank in Germany, in the National Bank, and that's going to be important because that is going to help translate directly into World War II as well, outside of the Versailles Treaty. We also have the British-led revolts in the Middle East, the Pan-Arab Revolt, which failed, but the end of World War I saved the goals of the Pan-Arab Revolt, where some of those nations were split off on their own from the old Ottoman Empire as the Ottoman Empire fell. So what that's going to do is also, during World War I, we see the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is where England and France drew up spheres of influence in the Middle East, and Britain effectively betrayed all the promises they made to the Arabs. So between those two items, you have the foundation laid for a lot of the discord in the Middle East. I mean, this is all coming together, but just wait, we'll keep going. So we get into the 1920s. In the 1920s, there's rampant market speculation all over the world, but primarily in the United States. And people were buying stocks on margin loans, where they would only put up a certain portion of the money for their stock purchased, while lenders and creditors were providing the rest. Okay? So the whole market run-up of the Roaring '20s was all on credit. And this was kind of facilitated by the new central banking system, by the way. But the money was still backed by gold at the time, so the Federal Reserve System didn't have the ability for endless creation that it does today. But we'll see how it will get there, because that is its goal. So these loans were eventually called in. So everything was great while the money was easy and being loaned out by these financial institutions, but then the crash actually occurs because they call in all those margin loans. And these people are investing on margin loans over and over and over again, and they've built up these positions that are all based on debt. So people are selling off to try to cover their margin loans, which tanks the entire stock market in the United States. So that results in the Great Depression of 1929. And I have to remind you, at that time, the central banking system is already set up. So if the central banking system's already set up, then all the financial institutions are beholden to the central bank. And why that's important is you have all these creditors and banks loaning the money for the margin calls, and that means those same creditors and banks called in the margin loans. So effectively, depending on what you view their intentions as, they either made a drastic error or they intentionally caused the Great Depression. I would err on the side of they intentionally caused it when you see the power and the wealth and the control they gained out of the Great Depression. So let's see where that takes us. So the Great Depression happens 1929. The Federal Reserve, by the way, sat by and watched it happen. They barely intervened at all, which kind of lends credence to the idea that it was ultimately a whole setup. So they basically do nothing. The Great Depression primarily affects the United States, but it affects the world as well, and it spreads largely into Germany because there were a lot of ties between U.S. and German industrialists in the Weimar Republic. So Germany takes a big hit. Now, the Great Depression is actually what cements the rise of Hitler. Hitler had tried to putsch, it failed. The Weimar Republic started recovering, and then with the Great Depression, the Weimar Republic takes a massive hit. And that's what really leads to Hitler coming to power. So the Great Depression pretty much created the Nazi Party and Hitler as the power that they came to be within Germany. So it seals the fate of the German Weimar Republic. 1933, the U.S. conducts gold seizures. Now, I want you to really try to understand and wrap your head around this. The gold seizures, they basically said you can't hang on to all these gold coins that are in circulation. And they actually came up with stiff penalties of 5 to 10 years and even conducted sting operations to bust people for not turning in their gold. And once the gold was turned in, they revalued the gold. So that went, I think it was $20 an ounce, I believe, and it went to $35 an ounce. So they forcibly seized everyone's tangible specie, and then they revalued it while they were holding on to it. So they effectively almost doubled their holdings by doing that. And the gold was now removed from public circulation, and the dollar was revalued by its relation to gold. So they took control of the gold supply and profited by almost 100% in doing so. So that's important to think of, because it's going to translate into these later economic developments. So we're actually seeing a seizure of gold and sting operations. I mean, in a supposedly free country, folks. So if you think you're free, think again. This goes all the way back to the 30s, where they're arresting people for having gold. I mean, come on now. So the whole public was fleeced during the gold seizure. 1937, the Nazis, they reassert national control of the Reichsbank. So the Reichsbank was a central bank, and the Nazis came in and reasserted national control over the bank. And this is extremely important, because none of the Western powers did anything about the Nazis up until this time. Hitler was Man of the Year. He was lauded as an economic miracle for Germany. And he had a lot of ties to American and British industrialists, including Henry Ford, which everyone knows about him. But there was a whole Anglo-German society of industrialists where these Germany and England and America were all linked together by this cadre of industrialists. And I'm going to get into this more when we talk about World War II as a rich man's trick. But it's very important to understand that they didn't do anything about the Nazis. They didn't even give them much negative PR until they reasserted control of that central bank. 1937 to 1939, World War II begins. I'm going to have to go through this real quick because I'm running out of time here. So World War II, we see the stagnation of Britain as the world dominator, the rise to preeminence of the USA, eventual power status of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was basically handed most of Eastern Europe, which became their satellite states. And this is important to understand. They also grew into the Caucasus, into Central Asia, obtained parts from the Japanese Empire. And it's really what created the ability for the Cold War to happen, was the rise of preeminence of both the USA and Soviet Union with the end of World War II. And that's going to be important for part 2 when we get into post-World War II era, Cold War. Also, here's a few things most people don't realize. World War II, it led to the eventual loss of China to communism. We supported Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, which did most of the fighting against the Japanese, took most of the losses, while the communists were slowly growing in power. So eventually it led, as a result, to the rise of Mao Zedong and the communists. Handed Yugoslavia to communism as well, which I'm not going to expound on because of time issues right now. Also, very important, the synthesis of Israel. We combine the World War I developments of Sykes-Picot with the synthesis of Israel. We now have the foundation for almost every problem in the Middle East that exists today. Most important, though, 1941, American Aramco, American Oil Company, started developing Saudi oil. That's going to be very important for later in the post-Bretton Woods era. And so we've already discussed the creation of the Cold War paradigm. So I've got about a minute now to tell you about Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods was an agreement, an international monetary agreement, which led to the preeminence of the U.S. dollar while retaining a nominal gold backing of international currencies. But what this really leads to is the foundation of the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency, and is the foundation for the petrodollar, which is also going to tie in to the whole Saudi Arabia story, which we're going to really touch on more in the next edition. So this is Lost Generation. This is the first half of the 20th century through the global chessboard strategy. And I hope you really understand the things I'm laying down on this. And you can research any of this you want. This is still one man's opinion because I'm not citing sources. But Lost Gen, I'm out.